Manchester City have just won the treble, so the big question is, how do you improve a squad that's won everything? Welcome to Sensible Transfers. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the Man City squad, we're going to try and identify weaknesses in it, and then suggest sensible solutions in the transfer market. We're not interested in rumour, we're not interested in conjecture, all we want is sensible solutions on the field. So with all of that in mind, let's have a think about Manchester City. Now on the board in front of me, I've got the Manchester City squad as things stand, and there are some areas in this squad which do seem a little bit thin on the ground. Now there's a reason for that, and that is that Pep Guardiola likes to use small squads. There's some advantages to that, one of which is that you don't have to share all of the minutes around a lot of players. You can actually keep the players happy by having a smaller squad. And Pep Guardiola is able to get away with that because he's a very innovative coach. He's able to move players around positions, and as a result of that, he's able to keep his squad nice and small. But Manchester City have already made some moves in the transfer market. For example, they've brought in Mateo Kovacic from Chelsea to fill this space that has been opened up by Ilkay Gundogan going to Barcelona. And then there's another player, Josko Gvardiol, who they've been very strongly linked to. He's a centre-back at RB Leipzig, and the big question is, why might Manchester City be going for someone like Josko Gvardiol? And in order to answer that question, we do need to think a little bit about tactical theory. Now, this is Manchester City's opening day squad from the beginning of last season in the game against West Ham, and as we can see, we've got two centre-backs and then two full-backs in Cancelo and Walker, and then the rest of the 4-3-3 follows suit. And as you can see, at the beginning of last season, Manchester City were playing with a flat back four. Now, the idea here is that when you're trying to build up from the back, you're able to benefit from having a huge amount of width. What that's going to do is it's going to pull the opposition press a long way apart and create space that you can then exploit in your build-up. So when you are building up from deep, the idea is that you have all of these opportunities to actually get the ball under control. Once you're under control, the ball is in settled possession. What you're going to do is you're going to see maybe one or even two of your fullbacks coming inside to invert into the middle here. And so you'll either end up with a 2-3 shape here with the two fullbacks on either side of the pivot player, or maybe one of the fullbacks will be a little bit deeper, and so you have more of a 3-2 shape. So three centre-backs and then two double pivot players. Now the idea of this is twofold. On the one hand, it gives you nice compaction around the ball so that you can pass the ball around, keep it away from the opposition press, and hopefully play it into the forward line. But also, because you're sitting in this nice compact shape, it gives you a huge amount of defensive coverage in the middle, and that should afford the 2-8s the possibility of getting into these more advanced areas now, because they're not worried about leaving space in here because it's being protected by this pack. But there's a problem here for Pep Guardiola, and that is that Joao Cancelo, midway through the season, decides to go off to Bayern Munich, and this raises the question, how do you end up in these sorts of shapes in your build-up when you don't have an inverting fullback? Now the obvious solution here is to keep things exactly the same and just find a fullback who can invert for you. So for example, you might bring in John Stones as a centre-back and then just have Kyle Walker inverting here. But Kyle Walker isn't the ideal fullback to do this inversion, and so a better solution could be to play John Stones in the wide area, bring in another centre-back in Akanji, and then you can have Stones inverting from the wide area. But actually the solution that Guardiola landed upon was much more elegant than this, because rather than starting with a flat back four and moving into this 3-2 shape or 2-3 shape, what Guardiola decided to do was just start off with this shape from the beginning. So what he did is he brought in Rico Lewis, who's a youngster who came through the City Academy, played him as a double pivot midfielder alongside Rodri, and what Manchester City did in their deep build-up was that they actually formed a flat back four using the goalkeeper as a centre-back as well. And the idea then is that once you've got settled possession, you can move back into this shape and you're exactly where you wanted to be. But although they're not using a flat back four in build-up, they actually end up in that sort of shape in defensive transition, because what happens is when the opposition are attacking, what you would see is one of the pivot players, in this case Rico Lewis, dropping into that back line just to cover the space, to give a little bit more coverage in a defensive sense. But there's another problem for Guardiola here as well, and it's not just that Rico Lewis is quite a small, slight player, and actually quite a different physical profile to the rest of the players around him. It's that in those defensive moments, he's having to travel a huge amount of distance to cover the space. And what happens is if an opposition player gets into this area and he hasn't tracked back, what you'll see is the centre-back covering for him, and then space opens out into this sort of area, which can then be exploited by the opposition. And so Pep Guardiola arrives at his final evolution of Manchester City last season, and that is to take Rico Lewis out, play John Stones instead, and now in defensive transition, rather than Stones having to pull out into the fullback area, he can actually just drop back into the back line in between the centre-backs, and that means that if Akanji is pulled out, there isn't a huge amount of space that can be exploited by opponents. But it's worth noticing now that Manchester City are playing without fullbacks and without wing-backs, which means that space opens up in these wide areas here, and that means that the opposition can try and exploit them, and as a result result of that, what you need is outside centre-backs who can perform the role of these wide players, and that means they need to be able to be good at defending these moments when oppositions are going to try and exploit the openness of the wide area. So you need really good 1v1 defenders in these positions, but you also need in possession centre-backs who are really good at carrying the ball into the space that opens out and then play really nice progressive passes into the forward line as well. So this is a really important position for Pep Guardiola now, and that is why they're so desperate to get Joško Gvardiol in, because he is the best player on the left-hand side to play this kind of position. He's a brilliant 1v1 defender, he's also a brilliant ball carrier, and he's great at passing the ball as well. So it's clear that Pep Guardiola wants to keep this sort of shape in his build-up going into the future. But because Gvardiol is the best player in the world in this position, he is not going to go to Manchester City for cheap, and RB Leipzig have made it very clear that they want to get cash dollar for him. Now, there are a couple of other options in the market that they could go for if they wanted to spend less money. For example, Alessandro Bastoni at Inter plays a very similar position to the sort of position that Gvardiol will be expected to play. He plays on the left side of a back three for Inter, but often has to move into these wide spaces. He's a really good ball passer as well, so he would be perfect for this sort of role. And if they wanted an even cheaper option, who would come with the added benefit of being a homegrown talent, then Levi Colwill has been playing really well for Brighton on loan from Chelsea this season, and he would be an excellent player under Pep Guardiola's tutelage as well. Now, if we look in the defensive end of the pitch, it does look as though Manchester City are really well catered for in these sorts of positions. But actually, there's a few players who may well be leaving. So João Cancelo and Aymeric Laporte are unlikely to be playing for Manchester City next season. Kyle Walker has been strongly linked to Bayern Munich as well. And there's also some players here who didn't get a huge amount of game time last season. So Rico Lewis didn't play much, Calvin Phillips didn't play much, and Sergio Gomez didn't play much as well. Now, if we start drawing on the pitch, those 5 positions that Pep Guardiola uses in the deeper areas, we can see there's not a huge amount of coverage in each of these 5 positions. Now, John Stones played most of the second half of the season in this double pivot position alongside Rodri, and we could use Lewis and Phillips as backups here, but even still, there's not a huge amount of coverage for these various positions that are so fundamental to Pep Guardiola's build-up units. And this is why Manchester City's links to Declan Rice make so much sense, because Rice is the perfect sort of player for this unit of build-up. He's a really physical player, he's very good defensively, but he also has the in-possession capabilities, particularly on the ball, to be able to really thrive in this sort of position. And he's also quite flexible, so you could use him to support Rodri if Rodri isn't available, but he could also be used in this position as well, the John Stones position, where he's expected to play as a double pivot and then drop out into the centre-back areas in defensive moments. There's also the possibility that he could be played in the 8 spot as well, but I do think that his skill set is much more suited to playing in this build-up unit of 5 players. But that does mean that we do have to address the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is the big space that has been left behind with Ilkay Gundogan going off to Barcelona this summer on a free. Now, Mateo Kovacic has been brought in from Chelsea, as we said, but he's not really a like-for-like replacement of Gundogan, and so I think the best thing for Manchester City to be able to do this summer is to bring in a really elite 8, spend a lot of money, and bring someone in who can do some of the things that Ilkay Gundogan was doing before he left. So what was it that Ilkay Gundogan did for Manchester City? Well, first and foremost, he was actually a really dangerous box arriver. So I've got here all of Gundogan's non-penalty shots in the Premier League since 2018-19. And this is a really impressive shot map because it looks very much like a striker's shot map. You can see a lot of chances in and around the goal, really dangerous areas. And as you can see, all of these red dots here are goals. He scored a lot of goals in the 6-yard box, but also around the penalty area as well. So he's basically coming in and playing as a second striker. He's a box arriver, and he's a really dangerous threat at that. But he's not just a box arriver, he can also do other things as well, and that shows up quite nicely on this touch map. So this is his touch map in all of his games for Manchester City in the Premier League, and as you can see, most of his activity coming in this left half space here, so really involved in the build-up. So what we want to see from a Gundogan replacement is someone who can involve themselves in the build-up, can be really good in tight spaces, a good technical player, but also someone who has the ability to be a box arriver as well and score some goals for Manchester City. And so with all of that in mind, my suggestion for a sensible transfer for a number 8 position for Manchester City is Florian Wirtz of Bayer Leverkusen. Now, Florian Wirtz is one of the most exciting youngsters in world football today. He is only 20 years old, so his career is stretching in front of him, and he's one of the best technical players that you will see in world football. And that creativity shows up really nicely in the data. So for example, his assists are in the 96th percentile for attacking midfielders. Also his shot creating actions are right up in the 96th percentile as well. Now we have already said that Gundogan was a really good box arriver. And if we look at Wirtz's data, we can see that there's not quite the amount of volume of goals that you would want from someone in that position. But there are a few things to note. Firstly, he is scoring goals at an average rate for what you would expect for players around this position. But actually, if we look down here at the shots total, we can see that he's in the first percentile for shot volume. So you would think that if he's able to increase that volume of shots, then it would translate into an increase in the volume of goals as well. The other thing to mention is that Florian Wirtz is much more of a creative playmaker than İlkay Gundogan, and we've seen the story of this season has been how to get Erling Haaland scoring goals. And if you paired up Wirtz with Haaland, you might actually see a benefit in that area as well. The only downside with a player like Wirtz is that he is just coming off a really bad knee injury, and there are still questions about how that might affect his longevity. But if Manchester City are looking for a profile much closer to Gundogan's, then they need look no further than the Premier League itself, because I think that Ebiri Eze of Crystal Palace is the perfect replacement for İlkay Gundogan. So as you can see from his data, no worries whatsoever in terms of the attacking side of his game. He likes to get into the box and he likes to score a lot of goals. So he would definitely be reproducing that box crashing element of Gundogan's game. And then elsewhere we can see he is still a creative player who's going to be generating chances for his teammates as well. Not quite to the same level as Florian Wirtz, but he would definitely be generating production for Manchester City. And interestingly, he wouldn't necessarily be doing it in the same way as Wirtz, because as we said, Florian Wirtz is a really good passer of the ball, whereas with Eze, what we're seeing is a really good carrier of the ball. So 84th percentile in terms of progressive carries means that Eze would be adding something very different to Manchester City's midfield. Now you may think that Eze isn't the sort of elite signing that Manchester City should be making, but as we've seen, he profiles really nicely against Gundogan, and if we've learned anything from the history of Pep Guardiola, it's that he can bring in players that are often undervalued and make them fit his system perfectly, and I think this is exactly what would happen if Eze went to Manchester City. But maybe there's a different solution here, because if you're looking for a really elite 8 to replace İlkay Gundogan, well, there is one right there in the Manchester City squad itself, in Phil Foden, who you know is a really exciting young technical player who can play it in the centre as well. But if Foden does come inside to solve that number 8 problem, then it does expose weaknesses elsewhere in the Manchester City squad, because suddenly they start to look very thin on the ground in the wide areas. So we've got Jack Grealish on the left, obviously a great player. He is backed up by Cole Palmer, who is an exciting youngster coming through, but he might also be better used coming inside as well. And then over on the other side, we have Riyad Mahrez and Bernardo Silva. Now Bernardo Silva can be used in central spaces as well, so he can give an extra bit of cover in those 8 slots, but he's also been linked with moves away, as has Riyad Mahrez. But if either of those two were to leave, then it would leave Man City really thin on the ground in those wide areas. So maybe the solution here is to bring in some wide attacking players, particularly on the right-hand side. So what is needed from wingers in a Pep Guardiola system? Well, the most important thing is width, because as we know, Pep Guardiola likes his wingers to actually pull the opposition back line apart and get isolated 1v1 against fullbacks. Now, ideally, you want your winger to be able to go both ways past an opposition fullback, because that adds a level of uncertainty to that fullback, makes it much harder to defend against the winger. But the idea is that either you get in behind the fullback in the wide area, and then you can play these cutbacks and crosses to the edge of the box or into the penalty area itself and generate these dangerous chances, or you can cut inside, try and get these crosses into the back post, or even take shots yourself. And then in terms of other attributes that Pep Guardiola wants from his wingers, he wants them to be able to retain possession as long as possible. He doesn't want them to give easy turnovers of the ball. And then out of possession, he wants them to be intense, stop the opposition from being able to have easy possession in their own half as well. And because, as we've said, Manchester City should be looking in the really elite markets here, there isn't a huge amount of players to choose from that fit this profile. But one player who does is Bayern Munich's Kingsley Coman. Now, Coman has the advantage of having played for a Guardiola team before, because Guardiola was the manager of Bayern when Coman arrived, and that means that there's certain things that we know he will be able to do. We know that he'll be good in terms of the out of possession side of things, and we also know that he understands how a Pep Guardiola system works, and that's really important, because as we saw, Jack Grealish took a whole season to get up to speed with that before he really hit the ground running. So all of this means that this sort of transfer is much more reduced in terms of risk. And then if we look at the data, we can see there's no issues there, because it's just green bars all the way down. This is an elite winger who would have no problem fitting in at Manchester City. Now, it is worth saying that Coman is a right-footed winger and Riyad Mahrez is a left-footed winger, so these would be slightly different profiles of player. You would expect Coman to go down the right more often than he would to cut inside. But if Manchester City did want to have a like-for-like profile, then another option here is Rafinha of Barcelona. Rafinha is a left-footed winger, but he can crucially go both ways. He's really good both at cutting inside and taking shots, and also actually getting down to the byline and cutting the ball back. And that shows up really well in the data because, as you can see, his assist numbers are right up there. His expected assists up in the 96th percentile, and actually probably gives Barcelona more upside as a creator of goals than a scorer of goals as well. And that would make him perfect for Pep Guardiola. Now, there are questions about whether or not Rafinha would be disciplined enough in possession of the ball because, as we've said, Guardiola likes his wingers to be really safe in possession and not give away potential turnovers to the opposition. And Rafinha is a really high volume creative player, so what he's going to try and do is get into the final third and play these really risky passes to try and pull something off. And that's something that Guardiola would probably want to iron out of his game. But on the other hand, we do know that Rafinha is really good out of possession. He's played under Marcelo Bielsa at Leeds, and this would be a real upside for Guardiola as well. Now, for all four of these players that we've mentioned so far, I haven't said anything about contract, and all of these players do have fairly lengthy contracts to their name. But as we said, Manchester City should be aiming to get a really elite player in here, and so the expectation should be that they will have to pay a lot of money. So what does this look like on the field? Well, it all depends how Manchester City want to solve the number 8 problem. If they want to solve it in the transfer market, then we may see someone like Florian Wirtz coming in, someone like Iberi Eze as well. But if they decide to solve the problem of the 8 internally, they could bring someone like Phil Foden inside, but this will then expose a weakness in the wide areas, particularly on the right. And so what we might see then, someone like Kingsley Coman or Rafinha brought in to really raise the profile of that right winger in this system. But the most important thing to remember is that it's impossible to predict what Pep Guardiola will do next, and so Manchester City next season will probably look nothing like this. And that was Manchester City Sensible Transfers. Bye!
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.